In Chapter 1 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, Columbus, the Indians and Human Progress is explored. This chapter examines Christopher Columbus's arrival in America from a different perspective than what has been traditionally taught to generations past. It looks at how his discovery was not only detrimental for Native Americans but also caused an immense amount of suffering throughout history due to European colonization that followed it. Additionally, this chapter discusses how progress can be seen as both positive and negative depending on who you are looking through the lens with. While some may see technological advancements or economic growth as beneficial, others might view them differently when considering their effects on people living within those societies, such as displacement or exploitation. Finally, this section concludes by noting that although there have been many advances since then, they do not necessarily equate to true human progress if we ignore its consequences upon certain groups like indigenous populations around the world today still facing oppression because colonialism never truly ended despite being officially declared over centuries ago. Chapter 2 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on how racial divisions were created in America. It begins with a discussion about slavery and indentured servitude, which was used to create an artificial division between white people and black people. The chapter then goes into detail about laws that were passed throughout history to further this divide, such as the Naturalization Act of 1790, which limited citizenship rights for non-whites, Jim Crow laws enacted after Reconstruction, segregation policies enforced through violence or intimidation during World War II, redlining practices implemented by banks in order to deny loans based on race or ethnicity, and finally affirmative action programs designed to address past discrimination against minorities. Finally, it looks at some positive steps taken towards equality since 1965, including civil rights legislation like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act 1964 prohibiting employment discrimination based upon race/ethnicity/gender, etc., Voting Rights Acts protecting minority voting access from discriminatory state regulations, Equal Credit Opportunity Acts outlawing credit denial due solely because someone is part Native American Indian, among other things. Chapter 3 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on how people in mean and vile condition were treated during colonial times. The chapter begins with a discussion about indentured servants, who had to work for their masters without pay until they could buy or earn enough money to be free again. It then moves on to discuss African slaves, whose labor was essential for the success of many plantations throughout America but who received no compensation whatsoever from their owners. Finally, it looks at Native Americans and how Europeans used them as pawns in land deals that often resulted in displacement and death due to disease or warfare between tribes competing over resources. In conclusion, this chapter paints a bleak picture of life for those living under oppressive conditions before American independence was declared. However, it also serves as an important reminder that even though these individuals may have been considered lesser citizens than white colonists at the time, they still played an integral role in shaping our nation today. Chapter 4 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on how tyranny is still present in America, even after its independence from Britain. He begins with a discussion about slavery and how it was an integral part of American society for centuries before being abolished during the Civil War. The chapter then moves to discuss other forms of oppression, such as Native Americans who were forced off their land or African Americans subjected to Jim Crow laws that kept them separate but unequal until they were overturned in 1964. Additionally, he talks about labor exploitation through child labor and dangerous working conditions which led to strikes throughout history like those at Haymarket Square, 1886, or Homestead Steel Works, 1892. Finally, he discusses war profiteering, where companies make huge profits while soldiers are sent into battle without proper equipment or training leading up to World Wars I and II respectively. In conclusion, despite all these advances towards freedom since 1776, there remains much work left undone when it comes fighting against injustice today, whether economic inequality between classes/races, environmental destruction due lack regulation, militarization abroad, etc. Chapter 5 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on how a revolution in thought and action occurred during the 1960s. It begins with an overview of civil rights movements, including those led by Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The chapter then moves to discuss other social justice issues such as women's liberation, gay rights movement, anti-war protests against Vietnam War, etc. In addition, it looks at various forms of protest like sit-ins, freedom rides, draft resistance campaigns, etc., which were used for bringing about change in society. Finally, it talks about how these changes affected American politics leading up to Nixon era, where he tried to suppress dissent through his policies but ultimately failed due to strong opposition from people who had been empowered by their own actions throughout this period. Chapter 6 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on how women, African Americans, and Native Americans were oppressed in America. It begins with a discussion about gender roles during colonial times when men had more power than women due to their economic status as well as religious beliefs that favored male authority over female autonomy. Women faced discrimination from both society and law, which limited their rights, such as not being able to own property or vote until much later in history. The chapter then moves on to discussing slavery, where it was legal for white people to buy, sell, and trade black slaves who did not have any basic human rights nor freedom despite living within American borders. This led many enslaved individuals into revolting against slave owners, but they often failed because there wasn't enough support from other groups at the time like abolitionists or free blacks who could help them fight back legally through court systems, etc. Finally, Zinn talks about Native Americans whose land was taken away without consent, leading up displacement amongst tribes while also facing violence inflicted upon them by settlers/colonizers trying to take control over resources found on these lands, i.e. gold. In conclusion, he argues that all three minority groups experienced oppression throughout U.S. history, even though each group has its unique struggles based off different factors including race and gender identity. Chapter 7 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on Native Americans and their struggles against European settlers. The chapter begins with a discussion about how Europeans viewed Native American culture as primitive, which led to them being treated unfairly in many ways. It then goes into detail about various wars between natives and colonists, including King Philip's War, 1675–76, Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763, and Tecumseh's attempt at uniting tribes for resistance against white settlement, 1811. These efforts were ultimately unsuccessful due to superior military technology possessed by the colonizers. This was followed up with treaties that further stripped away land from native peoples while also introducing diseases like smallpox that decimated entire populations. In addition, government policies such as Indian Removal Act forced thousands more of their ancestral lands onto reservations where they faced poverty and deprivation until today, when some still struggle for recognition or sovereignty rights over tribal territories despite having been promised these things through treaty agreements long ago. Chapter 8 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn is titled "We Take Nothing by Conquest, Thank God." It begins with a discussion on how American history has been written from an imperialist perspective and that it ignores or downplays any acts of resistance against imperialism. The chapter then goes into detail about various instances in which Native Americans resisted European colonization, such as Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763–64, and Tecumseh's War, 1811. These rebellions were ultimately unsuccessful due to superior military technology possessed by Europeans at the time, but they still managed to cause significant disruption for colonial powers. After discussing these events, Zinn moves on to other examples where indigenous people fought back against imperial forces, including King Philip's War, 1675–76, Metacom's Rebellion / King Philip's War II, 1689–97, Red Jacket and Handsome Lake Resistance Movement, 1800–1815, Seminole Wars I and III respectively, 1814–1819, 1830–1840, 1850–58. He also discusses some lesser-known cases like Black Hawk War led by Sauk leader Black Hawk, who was defeated after 2 years-long struggle. In conclusion, he argues that despite all their efforts, Native Americans could not stop European conquest because they lacked technological superiority over them. However, this does not mean there wasn't any form of resistance put up during those times. Rather, many tribes did fight bravely, even if unsuccessfully, in order to protect their land rights and freedom from foreign invaders. The chapter begins by discussing the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued in 1863 and declared that all slaves were free. However, this proclamation did not actually end slavery. It only freed those who lived in states still under Confederate control at the time of its issuance. The Union Army then began to occupy parts of these former slaveholding states as part of their effort to defeat the Confederacy. As they occupied more territory, Lincoln's government extended freedom further into areas where there had been no emancipation before, but even here African Americans faced a new form of oppression: military rule without civil rights or legal protection from white violence and discrimination. In response to this situation, some blacks formed self-defense organizations such as Robert Small's South Carolina Rifle Club, while others sought refuge with Northern troops stationed nearby for safety against local whites' attacks on them or their property, such as livestock. In addition, many black men joined up with Union forces either voluntarily or through conscription so they could fight for their own liberation alongside other soldiers fighting against slavery throughout America's Civil War battles, like Fort Wagner near Charleston Harbor SC, an event made famous by Glory starring Denzel Washington and Matthew Broderick among others. This participation helped lead towards eventual victory over Southern armies, but also resulted in thousands being killed during combat operations, due largely because commanders often placed them directly onto front lines instead, using better tactics/strategies available at times when facing enemy firepower head-on would have otherwise proven too costly overall if done differently, strategically speaking. Afterwards, Reconstruction efforts followed suit, whereby Congress passed laws granting citizenship status along voting privileges, etc. Yet despite progress achieved via legislation, much remained unchanged since most Southern state governments refused to comply fully, thereby leaving newly emancipated citizens vulnerable again, especially considering how little economic opportunities existed outside plantation labor system itself, thus leading back towards same-type servitude, albeit now legally sanctioned one way, shape another depending upon particular circumstances each person found themselves within given moment. In Chapter 10 of A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn examines how American imperialism has been used to expand and maintain power. He begins by discussing the Spanish-American War in 1898, which was fought over Cuba's independence from Spain. The war resulted in a victory for America as they gained control over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while also establishing an open-door policy with China that allowed them access to markets there. This led to increased economic growth, but at great cost. Millions died due to disease or violence during this period, including Filipinos who were fighting against U.S. occupation forces after their country declared its own independence following Spain's defeat. Zinn then looks at other examples of imperialistic actions taken by America, such as annexing Hawaii without consent from native Hawaiians and intervening militarily throughout Latin America under Theodore Roosevelt's Big Stick policy. In addition, he discusses World War I, where President Woodrow Wilson sought not only military victory but also moral justification through his 14-point speech outlining what would become known as liberal internationalism, a belief that nations should cooperate together peacefully rather than resorting back into conflict again like before World War I began, which ultimately failed. Finally, Zinn concludes Chapter 10 noting how despite all these efforts towards global domination, it is still up for debate whether or not any nation can truly dominate another, given human nature itself will always be unpredictable no matter what kind of system one tries to impose upon others. Chapter 11 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on robber barons and rebels. It begins with a discussion about how, in spite of all their wealth and power, these men were unable to prevent labor unrest from occurring during this period. The chapter then goes into detail about several key figures who played important roles in shaping American history: Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller Jr., J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, Jay Gould, etc. These individuals are described as having used ruthless tactics such as bribery or intimidation to gain control over industries like steel production or oil refining while simultaneously exploiting workers for maximum profit margins. Additionally, they often colluded together against competitors, which further increased their own personal fortunes at the expense of others' livelihoods. The second half discusses various forms that resistance took, including strikes, such as those led by Eugene V. Debs, boycotts, like those organized by Ida B. Wells Barnett, and other acts aimed at challenging corporate monopolies and oppressive working conditions. It also looks briefly at some successes achieved through collective action despite significant odds stacked against them due to lack resources/power held within society itself being heavily skewed towards wealthy elites rather than ordinary people trying to make ends meet day after day without any real hope for change coming anytime soon unless something drastic happened first before anything else could happen afterwards. To later down line, eventually, sometime, somewhere, somehow, someday, maybe one fine sunny afternoon when everything was just right again, finally, once more, forevermore, amen. Chapter 12 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on the socialist challenge in America. It begins with a discussion about Eugene V. Debs, who was one of the most prominent figures in American socialism and ran for president 5 times between 1900 to 1920 as an advocate for workers' rights and social justice reforms. The chapter then goes into detail about how socialists were able to gain traction during this period due to their focus on issues such as poverty, inequality, labor exploitation, racism/segregation, etc., which resonated strongly among working-class Americans at that time. However, they faced significant opposition from both government officials, who often used violence against them, and business owners alike who saw socialist ideas as a threat to capitalism itself. Despite these obstacles, though, many socialists still managed to make some progress through organizations like Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, National Women's Trade Union League, NWTUL, and NAACP amongst others, before eventually being crushed under pressure from WW1 hysteria and anti-communist sentiment post-1920s onwards, leading up until today, where there is very little support or recognition given towards any kind of left-wing politics within mainstream U.S. society. Chapter 13 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn examines how war has been used to increase state power and control. He argues that governments have often sought out wars in order to distract citizens from their own problems, while also providing a means for them to gain more resources or territory. In addition, he notes that during times of conflict, people are willing to give up some civil liberties in exchange for security and protection against enemies. This can lead states towards authoritarianism as they become increasingly powerful with each new victory on the battlefield. Finally, Zinn points out how those who benefit most from these conflicts tend not be ordinary citizens but rather large corporations which profit off supplying arms and other materials needed for warfare. Chapter 14 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn focuses on how people have responded to hard times throughout American history. He begins with a discussion about the Great Depression, noting that while some individuals and families were able to survive through government assistance programs such as Social Security or unemployment insurance, many more had no choice but to rely upon their own resources for survival. This led them into various forms of self-help, bartering goods and services, forming mutual aid societies, creating cooperative stores where members could purchase food at reduced prices, setting up soup kitchens in churches or other public places so those who couldn't afford meals would still be fed. In addition, he discusses labor unions, which provided workers with job security during difficult economic periods, as well as providing benefits like healthcare coverage when employers refused it outright. Finally, Zinn looks at examples from recent decades, including welfare reform efforts aimed at helping low-income Americans become financially independent despite limited opportunities available due to racism and sexism within society itself. Ultimately, his conclusion is that even though these measures may not always succeed in alleviating poverty completely, they can provide much-needed relief during tough times, something all too familiar today given current events around COVID-19 pandemic. In Chapter 15, Howard Zinn examines the Civil War that took place in America during Reconstruction. He argues that this was a conflict between two different visions of what kind of society should exist, one based on racial equality and economic justice for all citizens, and another which sought to maintain white supremacy through segregation laws, disenfranchisement of African Americans, and other forms of discrimination. The former vision ultimately won out with the passage of constitutional amendments guaranteeing equal rights regardless race or color, as well as federal legislation such as the Civil Rights Act, 1964, and Voting Rights Act, 1965. However, he also notes how these victories were not without their costs, including violence against Black people by whites who opposed change, nor did they bring about an end to racism in American life. Instead, it created new challenges for those seeking true freedom from oppression while simultaneously providing hope for future generations striving towards greater social progress. In Chapter 16 of A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn examines how socialism has been a part of American history since its inception. He begins by discussing early socialist movements in America such as Robert Owen's utopian communities and labor unions like the Knights of Labor. These organizations sought to improve working conditions for laborers while also advocating for social reforms that would benefit all citizens regardless of race or class. Zinn then looks at some key figures who helped shape this movement, including Eugene Debs, Emma Goldman, Big Bill Haywood, and Mary Harris Mother Jones, among others. All these individuals were passionate advocates for workers' rights, but they faced significant opposition from powerful business interests, which often resorted to violence against strikers and union organizers alike. Despite their efforts, however, there was still no major breakthrough in terms of achieving widespread reform until World War I, when President Wilson passed several progressive measures aimed at improving wages and safety regulations within industry sectors across the country. The chapter concludes with an examination on how socialists have continued to be active throughout modern times despite facing numerous obstacles along the way, due largely because many Americans are wary about embracing any kind of radical change, even if it could potentially lead towards greater equality amongst society members overall. In Chapter 17, Howard Zinn examines the history of resistance to war in America. He begins by discussing how American Indians resisted European colonization and expansion through armed struggle as well as diplomatic negotiations. The chapter then moves on to discuss various forms of protest against wars throughout U.S. history, including Shays' Rebellion, 1786–87, opposition to the Mexican War, 1846–48, and World War I, 1914–18. Additionally, he looks at anti-war movements during Vietnam era such as draft card burning protests or civil disobedience campaigns like those led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which sought an end to military involvement in Southeast Asia. Finally, Zinn discusses some contemporary examples of refusal from Iraq/Afghanistan wars that have been met with harsh government repression but still continue today despite this pressure. In conclusion, he argues that while there is a long tradition of dissent within American society, it has often been ignored or suppressed due to its unpopularity among mainstream political forces. However, these acts are essential for maintaining democracy and freedom from oppressive governments both domestically and abroad. Chapter 18 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, titled No Easy Victories, examines how Americans have fought for freedom and justice throughout history. The chapter begins with a discussion on the American Revolution, noting that it was not an easy victory but rather one achieved through hard work and sacrifice from many different people. It then moves to discuss other struggles such as abolitionism, labor rights movements in both North America and Europe during the 19th century, women's suffrage movement at home and abroad in early 20th century, civil rights struggle led by African Americans after World War II, anti-war protests against Vietnam War which were joined by students all over U.S. campuses, environmental protection efforts since 1970s, etc., showing how these various social movements had their own successes despite facing numerous obstacles along the way. Finally, this chapter ends with a reminder that even though there are no easy victories when fighting for change or progress, we must never give up hope because ultimately our collective actions can make a difference if done right. In conclusion, throughout its long history full of ups and downs, America has seen countless individuals fight bravely for what they believed was just and fair cause regardless odds stacked against them, proving time again why perseverance is key ingredient needed to achieve any kind of success worth having.